Let's turn now to the White House, where President Trump says he has signed the bill to release the Epstein files. That means the DOJ now has 30 days to release all its unclassified files related to the convicted sex offender. The signing came months after controversy that ended with the president reversing course and urging GOP lawmakers to back the bill. The president didn't sign the bill in front of cameras last night, though. Instead, he chose to announce it on social media. His post focused on Democrats and their association with Epstein. CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman joins us live from the White House. Willie James, good to see you today. Any indication of what we'll see from those files and when?
Hey there, Mugo. Good to be with you as well. Perhaps no surprise that the president didn't sign this bill publicly because the president wants to turn attention away from this whole Epstein Files saga. But within those files, we anticipate there could perhaps be flight logs, different types of investigative materials that could be released, as well as witness interviews, immunity deals. All of the information that's relevant essentially would have to be released in 30 days from the Department of Justice.
What's up, guys? Adam is here. So this is happening right now. Trump voluntarily signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act, his pen, his choice, no veto override, mandating full document release by a hard legal deadline with no exceptions. Then his own DOJ simply ignored it. No wiggle room in the law, no discretionary escape hatch. Just a president who made a public promise in writing and privately buried it.
Vera, thank you. The Department of Justice released what they called the remainder of the Epstein files today, 42 days after they were required by law to do so. The documents contain over 3 million files, including videos, photos, and email correspondences mentioning Elon Musk, former President Bill Clinton, Howard Lutnick, Bill Gates, and President Trump.
Some of the allegations in the new trove of documents include uncorroborated descriptions of parties at President Trump's Mar-a-Lago club involving underage girls, but there is no evidence of any wrongdoing on the part of the president. John Fenoglio with more on what's in the new document release and reaction from lawmakers. John.
Yeah, Micah, Cher, the Department of Justice was forced to release the documents as part of the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Now, the files contain hundreds of references to President Trump and other powerful men. The DOJ insists that neither the president nor the White House was involved in reviewing or redacting the files.
The Justice Department under Pam Bondi admitted there were roughly 6 million responsive documents. By the compliance deadline, they had released approximately 3 to 3.5 million pages. Do the math. That means somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million pages are still sitting inside the DOJ, missing, withheld, hidden from the American people despite a federal law that said release them all.
Breaking tonight, the Justice Department releasing more than 3 million pages of documents related to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. President Trump's name referenced hundreds of times. But what the Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche is saying tonight about the president and Jeffrey Epstein. Here's Pierre Thomas.
Tonight, the Justice Department releasing more than 3 million pages of documents from the FBI's investigation into sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche declaring they have now fully complied with the law.
Today's release marks the end of a very comprehensive document identification and review process to ensure transparency to the American people.
In a letter to Congress, Blanche and Attorney General Pam Bondi acknowledge approximately 200,000 pages have been redacted or withheld based on various privileges.
2.5 to 3 million Epstein-related documents that the law specifically required to be made public are gathering digital dust on government servers. And the specific reason those pages have not been released? The specific categories of information they contain? That is exactly what lawmakers from both parties and investigators from multiple credible outlets have been demanding to know. Let me give you the documented facts as reported by NPR, BBC, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, NBC, and others. These are not conspiracy theories. This is journalism from organizations that have been covering the Epstein document release process in forensic detail. NPR and the BBC conducted independent investigations and found something devastating. Dozens of pages involving sexual abuse accusations connected directly to Donald Trump were missing from the public database, even though the government's own internal indices show those pages exist. Let me repeat that because it is the most important sentence in this entire story. The government's own internal document tracking systems confirm that specific documents containing allegations connected to Trump exist in the system, and those specific documents are not in the public database that the Epstein Files Transparency Act required them to be released into. A top Democrat responded to that finding by saying the DOJ is withholding Trump-related abuse files from the American people. That is not a political attack. That is a documented finding based on the government's own internal records. When the government's own indices show documents exist and those documents are not in the public release, there is exactly one explanation. Someone decided those specific documents should not see the light of day, despite the legal requirement, despite the law, despite the president's signature, and the question of who made that decision and why is the foundation of the cover-up framing. Now let me take you to the House hearing room because this is where the accusations became official. At a bombshell hearing, Democrats accused Bondi and the Trump DOJ of running a massive Epstein cover-up. They pointed to the millions of unreleased pages. They pointed to the heavy redactions blanketing the documents that were released, especially where those documents touch on politically exposed figures. This is not a press release. This is sworn congressional testimony from lawmakers who have examined the specific documentary record of what was released and what was not. They made formal accusations of cover-up conduct in the most public and most official forum available. And then something happened that should make every person watching this video sit up straight. The concerns went bipartisan. Thomas Massie, a Republican; Ro Khanna, a Democrat; members of Congress from opposite parties who do not agree on much. Both have warned that Pam Bondi could face obstruction of justice charges for redacting or withholding names of government officials from the Epstein files. When a Republican like Thomas Massie is using obstruction of justice language about a Trump-appointed attorney general in connection with the Epstein document release, the bipartisan character of the concern tells you this is not politics. This is people looking at the same documented record and reaching the same alarming conclusion. Bipartisan obstruction warnings about the sitting attorney general do not happen in the normal course of political disagreements. They happen when the documented evidence of specific conduct is serious enough that people who disagree about everything find themselves agreeing about the fundamental character of what they are seeing. Now let me tell you about what is actually in the files that did get released. According to reporting from Al Jazeera and other outlets, the release files contain emails and communications in which Epstein and his associates discussed Trump. One message noted that he knew about the girls. Another witness claimed that everyone has known he has been doing this, and there is at least one specific woman who accused Trump of assault in the release materials. The DOJ characterizes these allegations as unverified and sensational. But here is the thing. If the released portion of the documents already contains this level of specific and damaging allegation against the president, what in God's name is in the portion that has not been released? The 2.5 to 3 million pages that the law said must be made public and that the government is still sitting on. That question is the core of the cover-up story. And it is a question that the documented gap between the internal indices showing the documents exist and the public database that does not contain them makes impossible to dismiss. The Epstein Files Transparency Act did not ask for good faith efforts. It did not provide for administrative discretion about which documents to prioritize. It required full release of all unclassified responsive documents within a specific legal deadline. A Justice Department that has admitted to approximately 6 million responsive documents and released only half of them is not in compliance with the law. Not arguably in compliance. Not partially in compliance subject to interpretation. Not in compliance. And a president who signed the law and whose Justice Department is not compliant with it is presiding over exactly the kind of deliberate non-compliance with a specific legal obligation that the cover-up framing most accurately captures. This is not complicated. The law said, release all unclassified documents. The documents were not all released. The people responsible for not releasing them knew the law required release. The specific documents not released include documents that internal indices confirm exist and that credible reporting identifies as specifically connected to Trump-related allegations. That is the documented factual foundation. Let me walk you through the three specific dimensions of the suppression pattern because each one compounds the others. The first dimension is the raw numbers gap. 6 million responsive documents admitted, 3 to 3.5 million released, 2.5 to 3 million missing. That is not a minor administrative shortfall. That is nearly half of the total responsive document universe. Nearly half of a disclosure that the law specifically required to be complete. That is documented in the government's own admissions. The second dimension is the redaction pattern. When documents are released but the names of specific individuals connected to the most sensitive allegations are blacked out, the functional effect is the same as not releasing those portions at all. The specific information that would be most damaging, the names of powerful people connected to specific allegations, is withheld from public view through the redaction mechanism. Lawmakers have specifically pointed to this pattern of redactions being most concentrated in exactly the portions of documents that touch on politically exposed figures. If legitimate legal privilege were driving the redaction decisions, the pattern would correlate with legal privilege categories. But it correlates with political sensitivity instead. That correlation is the most damaging evidentiary signal about the character of the redaction decisions. The third dimension is the internal indices finding. This is the single most specific and most legally damaging piece of the entire suppression pattern because it removes the possibility of innocent administrative explanation. When the government's own internal document tracking systems confirm that specific documents exist and those specific documents are not in the public release, the gap between the indices and the release is documented in the government's own records. You cannot claim the documents do not exist when your own indices show they do. You cannot claim they were inadvertently overlooked when they are specifically identified in the internal tracking systems. The only available explanation is a decision, a specific and deliberate decision to exclude those specific documents from the release that the law required. And when those specific documents are the ones that credible reporting identifies as connected to Trump-related allegations, the decision to exclude them is the most specific and most directly documented evidence of the cover-up. The government's own records are the evidence. That is not something you can spin away. Now let me talk about the legal exposure because this is real. The obstruction of justice statute covers conduct that corruptly obstructs or impedes official proceedings. A Justice Department that is required by specific statute to release documents and that instead withholds them in ways designed to prevent specific information from entering the public record is engaging in conduct that raises serious obstruction questions. The bipartisan warnings from Massey and Khanna about obstruction charges are specific applications of the obstruction statute to the documented pattern of non-compliant document suppression. Legal scholars with no political interest in the outcome have independently said this raises genuine legal concerns. A law required document release. The documents were not released. The decision not to release them was deliberate. The documents contain information directly relevant to ongoing and potential official proceedings. Those four elements create the specific factual foundation for an obstruction analysis. And then there is the perjury exposure. Bondi has testified under oath about the document release process. If she testified about the completeness of the release in ways that are inconsistent with the internal indices that confirm documents exist that were not released, that specific gap between sworn testimony and documented reality is the most precise and most legally actionable form of perjury exposure. The cover-up story and the Bondi accountability story are the same story approached from different directions. The cover-up story documents the conduct. The perjury story documents the sworn statements about the conduct. And the gap between the sworn statements and the documented conduct is the specific legal exposure that makes both stories so urgently relevant. The Watergate comparison is not hyperbole. It is the most instructive historical context. Watergate was ultimately a story about a president using the power of his office to suppress information that would damage him personally and politically. the specific mechanisms through which that suppression was attempted, the obstruction of the investigation, the destruction of evidence, the misleading testimony to Congress, are the same categories of conduct that the Epstein document suppression story documents in the current context. The specific thing that made Watergate the defining political scandal of the modern era was not the break-in itself. It was the cover-up, the deliberate use of official power to prevent accountability for specific conduct. In the Epstein document suppression story, a president who signed a transparency law presiding over a Justice Department that is not complying with it in ways that specifically protect documents connected to his own alleged conduct is the most direct available parallel to exactly that Watergate dynamic. Let me bring this home with 4 clear points. The documented suppression pattern combining the raw numbers gap, the heavy redactions concentrated in politically sensitive portions, and the internal indices confirming documents exist that are not in the public release, creates the most specific and most legally damaging evidence of deliberate non-compliance. The raw numbers gap is not an administrative shortfall. Nearly half the total responsive document universe unreleased is deliberate suppression at scale. The redaction pattern correlating most strongly with political sensitivity rather than legal privilege categories is specific evidence that the redaction decisions are politically rather than legally driven. And the internal indices finding is the single most damaging piece of evidence because it documents the gap between what the government's own systems confirm exists and what has been released in the government's own records. The bipartisan obstruction of justice warnings from Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna are the most important and most specifically credible signal in the entire accountability story because they represent members of Congress from opposite parties reaching the same alarming conclusion about the same documented record. Massie is a Republican. Khanna is a Democrat. They disagree about almost everything, and they are both warning about obstruction of justice charges for the same attorney general based on the same documented pattern of non-compliant document suppression. That bipartisan convergence on the same legal characterization of the same documented conduct is the most powerful available signal that the obstruction analysis is grounded in specific applicable legal principles rather than in political opposition. When Republicans and Democrats are using the same obstruction of justice language about the same documented conduct, the concern is real. The president who signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act, presiding over a Justice Department that is not complying with it in ways that specifically protect documents connected to his own alleged conduct, is the most direct and most specifically documented example of the gap between public commitment and private reality. Trump signed the law. The law required full disclosure. The disclosure is not complete. The missing documents include documents that internal indices confirm exist and that credible reporting identifies as connected to Trump-related allegations. The gap between the public signature on a transparency law and the private suppression of exactly the documents most relevant to the person who signed it is the specific and most direct available evidence that the transparency commitment was not genuine. The signature is on the law. The documents are missing. The indices confirm they exist. The reporting identifies their relevance to Trump. The cover-up is documented in the government's own records. Here is exactly what we need to watch. Watch the congressional oversight proceedings and any formal contempt or obstruction referrals that flow from the documented non-compliance. Formal congressional action is the most immediately consequential official response available. Watch any court proceedings related to media or advocacy organization requests for the release of the missing documents because judicial intervention would represent the most powerful available check on executive branch non-compliance. Watch the specific documents that get released in any subsequent tranches for any indication that the political sensitivity filtering is continuing or being corrected. And watch the Bondi accountability proceedings for any specific testimony about the document release decisions that creates additional documented discrepancies between sworn statements and the underlying documentary record. So here is the absolute bottom line. Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Trump signed it. The DOJ admitted to roughly 6 million responsive documents and released only half. Investigative reporting found that documents involving Trump-related allegations confirmed by internal indices to exist are missing from the public database. House hearings produced formal accusations of a massive Epstein cover-up from lawmakers who examined the documentary record. Massey and Kayana issued bipartisan warnings about obstruction of justice charges for Bondi. And the emails and FBI interview summaries already released contain specific and documented allegations involving Trump that make the missing half of the document universe so specifically alarming. The law was signed, the documents were not released. The indices confirm they exist. The reporting identifies their relevance. The bipartisan accountability warnings are on the record. And the gap between the public commitment to transparency and the documented private reality of suppression is the most specific and most consequential evidence of the biggest cover-up characterization that this entire administration has produced.